Ralphie lifts a finger, and a mouse is there.
Hello lovelies, today we're going to have a wee shufty at Free League's Alien RPG. Now originally I wasn't going to pick this up, wasn't going to bother. You can replicate Alien in a whole bunch of other games easily enough. Traveller is an obvious fit for it and so on, and I always felt that if you're running a game based on Alien, you're going to be kind of limited and everyone is going to know what's going on a meta level. The player is going to know all about the xenomorph. How could you not? And so kind of what is the point? And if you stray away from Alien exactly, then you're not going to be giving people what they want from an Alien role-playing game. So it's a bit of a weird one. But I thought about it, and I have a player who is super into Alien. Used to read the Dark Horse comics. Used to get compilations, Aliens and Predator, and occasionally there was Terminator or RoboCop and things that would cross over as well. And since the original Alien, we've had Aliens. There are no other sequels. And we've had Alien vs Predator, which was rubbish, but the comics were good. There's been suggestions that Alien and Blade Runner and Outland all exist within the same universe. It widens the scope a little, and there are interesting things you can do with the Alien. And if you've got decent role players who are going to get their characters to act as if they don't know about the xenomorphs, then things are better. But that isn't to say that these problems don't exist, but I think if you're cognizant of them going into the game, things are a bit better. So this is by Free League, and it uses their Year Zero engine. I'm not a huge fan, because I think requiring sixes on the dice makes things a little bit too difficult. But we'll get to that, I guess. Here we have a map of the known universe, settled systems, whatever. Not a great deal of information on the stuff that's out there, so that was kind of superfluous, I felt. It's a very dark book, just as they were very dark films to start with. I mean, it is nicely presented. You can't really take away from it for that, and the text is mostly called out in easier to read sections. It does feel a little bit CGI-y. I mean, I don't need to explain a lot of the background, do I? Everyone knows the xenomorphs, everyone knows the Aliens universe films and the less well thought out prequels with the slightly disappointing engineers and everything. But yeah, okay, we have a timeline. Basically goes up as far as Alien 3, which, as we all know, doesn't exist. There were only 2 Alien films ever. We all know that. So that's a reasonable cut-off point, and also interestingly, a point of divergence between the comics and the films. So if you want Hicks and Newt and Ripley to all still be alive and out there doing stuff, this is a good place for that kind of divergent timeline, I suppose. So, characters are defined by a bare handful of statistics, though I guess when you're playing sort of cinematically, which is one of the styles that they're just playing in, you don't need a huge amount of detail and depth. There are options for campaign play, but I think this works much better as one-shots, two-parters, that sort of thing, with a relatively small group of players. In a one-shot, you can also afford to be ruthless and deadly, which always helps with the horror atmosphere. So you have attributes, you have a career. A career defines your main attribute and your main skills, but you can pick up other skills from all over the shop as you wish. You get some free choices. Talents are like special knacks and abilities that are also determined by your career. Health is relatively low. You might have typically 2, 3, 4, perhaps 5 at the outside health, so death comes pretty quickly. Experience is determined by personal agendas, so you have things that motivate your character, that make you want to do stuff, and if you do that stuff, then you advance in certain ways. So you might get points that let you do re-rolls and so on, or contributing towards your experience. It also encourages you to choose a character who is your friend and a character who is your rival from the other players. Obviously that requires a session 0, which you may or may not want to bother with. And then you're pretty much done. By the by, so we get into details. So some of the careers that you can choose from are obviously the Colonial Marine, a Colonial Marshal, a Burke, a company agent, a kid survivor, so obviously that's meant to be for like Newt and other sort of teen kids and so on, a medic or doctor, an officer, a pilot. We all know what happens to pilots in Aliens. A roughneck, so a worker essentially. A scientist. You don't have to be evil when you're a scientist, but the temptation's obviously there. Fairly limited, but it's going to be relatively easy given the low fidelity of the system to come up with other career packages if you want to. Now, so here is the point at which I don't think a great deal of the Free League system, the Year Zero engine. When you're rolling dice, you put together a dice pool. So typically your attribute plus your skill. If you're really tightly focused on your character being super good at one thing, you might have as many as 9 dice, but you need a 6 for a success. And to guarantee a success, you're going to need more than 6 dice, and even then it's not fully guaranteed. So you can see that to be remotely competent at anything, you really need to have a massively high skill and stat combination. Failure is pretty much the default. Now, this is what I don't necessarily like about Year Zero engine. There are ways around that. They present them as features, but to me they're just ways of cope with the essential central flaw of the system. And I don't know how you get around it, really. So, I mean, they say you're only supposed to roll the dice in stressful situations, which helps a little bit. But even so, if you're like a hard-bitten Colonial Marine and you have a pulse rifle and you've had plenty of training and you're physically fit and capable, and you fire and you miss most of the time, that's going to be annoying and disappointing. So the way they get around that is that you can push yourself whenever you do anything like this, and that lets you re-roll all your missed dice, but it also gives you stress. Now this varies from iteration to iteration of the game, but in Alien, your stress also gives you bonus dice that you roll whenever you roll your skills and so on in the future. So as time goes on, you get hyped, more adrenaline, more stress, you get more dice, but those stress dice, if they roll a 1 on any of them, triggers a sort of stress event, a mental break, fear, whatever. This is great for modeling in Alien, and probably would be a good thing to bring into other iterations of the Year Zero engine. But these all feel like patches to the central essential problem, in that you're fantastically unlikely to do very well at anything, no matter how high your stats and skills are in the Year Zero engine. So this is a problem. This is an issue I have with their system overall. But I think this is probably one of the better iterations of it, because you get those bonus dice as you get stressed, and you're not that likely to collapse into a gibbering heap until you've built up several stress. But yeah, it does feel like a hastily slapped on patch to fix the problem. We have skill descriptions and what you can do with them. We have the talents, which is kind of like how feats are if you want to cross compare. So these give you access to certain special abilities or bonuses. So for example, the Colonial Marshal has the investigator ability. So you can, whenever you enter a scene, you can make an observation roll, and every success that you get, which will probably be none, lets you ask a certain set of questions about the scene immediately. Normally an observation roll, the games master might tell you what you find, or you might find something that was hidden or harder to find or whatever, but it's up to you to draw conclusions from what you find. With the Marshal, they can roll, and if they get successes, they can be told what happened. So one of the questions you can ask is, what happened here? I mean, if you stumble on a scene as a normal character and you make your observation roll, you might observe blood splatter patterns, boot prints, things like that, and then you put those clues together and you come to a conclusion, and as the player, exactly what happened here. With this, the investigator on a kind of meta level is good at that, and can just ask and thou shalt receive. Fair enough. Yeah, that works fine, and it helps give, though the special abilities help give each career class its own kind of sort of focus and feel. Combat, as I say, is deadly. Critical hits are particularly nasty and can cause lasting harm. You also take critical hits if you're reduced to 0 health, killed if you go further below that. The problem again comes down to the system. So a heavy pistol, for example, does 2 damage. If you're a somewhat average character with perhaps 3 or more health, 1 success, which is very likely all you're going to get as an attacker, you might knock someone down to 1 health with 1 shot. If you're really lucky, you might knock them down to 0, but for what is supposed to be a really deadly game, the weapons perhaps don't necessarily do enough damage. And until they do, because of the low number of successes that you're likely to get. Another way you can compensate, I suppose, is to hand out bonuses relatively easily. Certain equipment is meant to give you bonuses. Most of the weapons come with a certain number of bonus dice, or perhaps penalty dice. So that is another way of compensating for the system. The right tools for the job. The equipment lists aren't particularly huge or exhaustive. They don't need to be, because the system is such low fidelity that there isn't going to be that much difference between, say, a 357 Magnum and a 44 Magnum, so you don't really need to worry too much about all that. The equipment, therefore, is all fairly generic. This was a bit of a problem, I felt, in Twilight 2000, because one of the big appeals in Twilight 2000 has always been for gun nuts and military tech heads and wonks and so on, and so a high fidelity system made more sense because it could make a difference how you configured your weapon and that sort of thing, whereas that is kind of missing. That simulationist aspect is very much missing from the modern Twilight 2000. Here it doesn't matter so much, you know, you kind of want the more generic thing. There are vehicle and spaceship rules, they're probably not going to come into things too much if you're running a game after the start of the movies, so you don't need to worry too much about that. The background information is difficult, I guess, because the world in which Alien takes place isn't necessarily canonically particularly rounded out. So they kind of draw on things from the computer games, Alien Isolation in particular, and making other stuff up that does or doesn't necessarily fit with what we know from the comics and the novelizations and, you know, all the rest of that. But because it's not fantastically detailed in canon, there is plenty of room for you to come up with your own information, your own ideas, your own corporations, systems, planets, you know, all the rest of it, all that stuff that isn't detailed. So in some ways that's a feature rather than a bug, because there is room for you to, you know, stamp your own imprint on the world, make up your own stuff, and go off on one, really. Oh yeah, the games master is called Game Mother, after the AI. So there's some useful tips and so on here to do with running a horror game, because running a horror game is perhaps one of the most difficult genres to run in tabletop after comedy, perhaps. Tips for altering the game to do with cinematic play or campaign play. It's useful. I mean, if you're an old head, then you're going to know a lot of this stuff already, probably, but it's always useful to have a refresher, and for new players it's going to be, yeah, super interesting for them and super useful for them. Yeah, there is a lot of world detail that I'm not sure actually exists within canon, and they've put their own stamp on things, but again, like I say, yeah, it's not hugely rounded out, it's not hugely described, so there is room for you to put your own stamp and create your own stuff for this. There are examples of planets, not that many, but there aren't that many detailed in the game. Exploring is probably a good way to run into horrible stuff out there in the world, so there's that. Brief descriptions of different areas, territories, and so on. But again, you know, it's open for you to put your own stuff together. Seem to be saying a lot of the same thing. Yeah, the art is moody, but it does get lost. Actually, it looks higher contrast than it is on the camera. So, I mean, it's kind of moody, and that's kind of what you want. But it would have been nice to have some clearer illustrations of things like equipment or blueprints, or the technical manual type stuff might have been interesting to have in here and would have increased the value of the book overall, I think. In terms of aliens, we have our engineer ancestors. We have the xenomorphs, which everyone knows about, obviously, in their various forms, including some of the less fun, less interesting prequel stuff. Classic xenomorphs and their various incarnations: facehuggers, chest bursters, stalker, scouts, drones, soldiers, queens, descriptions of how the hives and so on work. And then we get into more sort of speculative stuff, added stuff, perhaps what Colonial Marines used to deal with on bug hunts, perhaps. A little bit fantastical, some stuff kind of missing from the comics that would have been useful to put in here, and tellingly no yautja, no predators, but it would be relatively easy to slot them into the game. And adventure ideas and generators. This is becoming more common and is more useful than an actual scenario, so not going to complain about that at all. There's probably enough material here if you wanted to mix it with something else to do single player missions that you could put together. So that's about it. And there are some supplementary books, I believe, already, but I don't know that you need them necessarily. You've got pretty much everything here that you need to run a sci-fi horror game based in the Alien universe, such as it is. In terms of style, I mean, it is very stylish. It does present itself well. It is very dark, which will make it harder to read for some people, but they do make the effort to make most of the text more readable. I can't help but feel that a lot of it gets lost, and a lot of it feels very computer generated and then darkened and like gammered to make it less definite. I would have liked a mix of different styles of illustration and so on, and less kind of Morkborgian layout. I mean, it's not as busy as Morkborg, but the spreads using up so much space, the text kind of fitting in around it. You have to go all in on that stuff if it's going to work. They didn't really go all in on it here. So it's stylish, the writing is good, but I can't give it a perfect score for style because of those choices and those omissions. So 4 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, weird one, right? Because the world isn't that fantastically well defined anyway, so there's a lot of made up details and information here, but you kind of want a lot of that space for you as a games master to create and think about. It's got all the basics that you need for an Alien or Aliens game and a bunch of prequel information. I would have liked to have seen more stuff from the comics and so on. It's either a high 3 or a low 4 for the substance, the material that's there. They made certain choices, I would have made other choices, so I'm less satisfied with it than you might be, but this is me reviewing it, so let's be generous, because otherwise Noodle will stab me in the ear and say it's the low 4 for substance. So out of 4 out of 5 for style, 4 out of 5 for substance. It wouldn't take that much to elevate it to a 5 in one or both of those scores. It's just I kind of disagree with the choices and the system, though I think this is one of the better implementations of Free League's Year Zero engine. I think that's what it's called. So yeah, 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. I recommend, but mostly if you're particularly into Alien or Aliens. Otherwise it's probably not for you. Zang. Welcome to St. Cloud is a system-agnostic setting of atmospheric surreal horror and investigation by Miguel Ribeiro. An isolated town set amongst forests and mountains, St. Cloud is a closed community of eccentrics and oddities. While system-agnostic, guideline statistics are provided for actual fucking monsters. You can get Welcome to St. Cloud at post-mort.com, lulu.com and drive-thru RPG.